Thank you for joining the KCP Winter Webinar Series. This year, KCP's Winter Webinar Series focuses on the themes of grasslands to wetlands, connecting diversity. We'll be offering 4 webinars over this winter. And just as we're getting people to join the webinar, we're just going to do a short little poll. We're going to ask about where you're based and what is your affiliation. So I'll just load that poll right now. So if you could just take some time and enter where you're based. Excellent, okay, and I'm just going to share the results. Looks like 45% are from the East Kootenays, 36 West, and 27% elsewhere in BC. So I'll just launch the second poll as we get more people on board. So if you can answer this poll about what is your affiliation? Great, and I'll just share those results. So we've got about 15% nonprofit, 38 consultant, 15 government, 8% First Nations, and 31% other. Great, thank you so much for sharing. So today is the first of 4 webinars that we have this winter. They're all excellent speakers coming up, as well as John Cathro today, and I'm excited that we have engaged them all for this year's series. So we will have fish and wildlife mapping, tools everyone should know about, coming this February 28th on Wednesday. We'll then have BC's Soil Information Finder tool, because what's underground matters, Thursday, March 8th. And lentic and lodic riparian assessment, a standardized approach, Monday, March 12th. So we hope you can join those. We'd just like to thank our sponsors. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do these kinds of activities. And just for the webinar information, the webinar will be approximately 45 minutes long with up to 15 minutes for questions at the end. As an audience member, you are on mute and will be on mute for the duration of the presentation so that we don't get distracting background noises or feedback. You can ask questions at any point using your question box feature on the webinar control panel. Only organizers will see these, and if appropriate, we can respond back or save your questions for the end of the webinar. You can also use your chat feature, and that can be seen by everybody. If you have any technical issues, you can just type into chat, and our communications coordinator for KCP, Nicole Trigg, will answer those for you. The webinar will be recorded and made available on our website. And also, I just wanted to let you know that I am the KCP Stewardship Coordinator who will be hosting the meeting. So I'd like to introduce John Cathro. He is a registered professional forester and independent consultant. His clients include First Nations, communities, companies, organizations, and governments across BC and around the world. He works on issues that include community wildfire protection, third-party certification, strategic land use planning, and conservation area management. John has 20 years experience working with complex multi-party situations involving jurisdictions, economic development, and cultural and ecological conservation. His approach is grounded in technical expertise and based on collaboration and capacity building. John has a graduate degree in forestry and land use from Oxford University and conflict management from Royal Roads University. John and his family currently live in Caslow, BC. So I'll hand over the presentation to John.
Good morning, folks. I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. Maybe Adrian, you could give me sort of a thumbs up there.
Yes, looks good. I can see your screen.
Thanks for joining, everybody. I see a few familiar names on the list of participants. Start my video. There we go. How's that? Yeah, great that people are joining. This is a subject I think that a lot of people are very interested in. Adrian gave a great introduction. I won't say anything more about myself, except to say that I am trained as a forester. I'm not a fire scientist. I don't pretend to be a fire scientist. But I will give you a little bit more context. I'm a forester, and I believe that forestry isn't actually about trees. I think forestry is actually about people, and that's one of the reasons there's a picture of people on my first screen here, and it's something I'm going to talk a lot about. Fire is obviously very complex. It's primeval. It's part of our ecosystem, and our ecosystems, as we know, are very, very complex. And humans are extremely complex as well, with our fears and our values, with our expectations, our relationship to each other, and with our environment. And I think we really see that in full color around an issue like wildfire, which is something that we're hearing a lot about these days. And I might note that not just here in British Columbia, but all over the world, of course. So I'm going to, there we go. Here's what I'm going to cover today. A very short history of fire and forests in our neck of the woods. The scope of the wildfire risk here in the Kootenays. And what can we do to reduce this risk? We're going to follow it with questions and answers. I'll make sure that we've got enough time for questions and answers, and I'll leave it up to Adrian to field those. This introduction, or this overview, there's really three components to time. Obviously, the history is looking backwards. The scope is looking at our current situation, and what do we do is about looking forward. And I think that's a very appropriate framing for something as complex as wildfire. In our neck of the woods, and I think a lot of people know this, maybe people don't, we started managing the forest almost as soon as we showed up, we being the settlers who came in here. First Nations had a very complex and very intelligent relationship with fire and forest, and ours was very different. There's some confusion about whether we burned off the forests to look for minerals, or whether they were escape fires from building railways, or a combination of the two. But around about 100 years ago, in particular here in the West Kootenays, huge amounts of the forests were set back to zero, literally burned off. And there's a few remnant patches of really, really old trees in wet gullies and dry outcroppings and that sort of stuff. But the extent is enormous. Archives have fantastic photos of what this looks like. This is here in Caslow, looking across the Moyer. And if you look at, this house, I'm not sure if the house was built after the fire or whether they just did a really, really good job fireproofing and doing what we now think of as FireSmart. But those sorts of things were very, very typical 100 years ago. And we can't underestimate ecologically how significant that is, that impact, to do that to the forest almost all at once, certainly within a very short period of time. And of course, the next thing that we did, once we realized that we could do things differently, is we started putting out fires, in particular after the Second World War. We've become, and thankfully so, because this is how we protect our communities. We've been very, very good at suppressing fires. That, of course, is arguably the greatest management impact that we've had in British Columbia, is suppressing fires. And this is work that some locals have done in our neck of the woods. And if you look at the fires in the last 50 or 60 years, you don't see those colors very often. Or the relatively new ones, the Kootenays fire above Harrop Proctor. Of course, there was a new fire above Harrop that was burning in here this year. But these colors are largely absent. And that's because we've been so good at eliminating fire. And again, we cannot underestimate the impact that is having. And that's not just here. When you read the stories of what is just happening and they're literally mopping up in places like California, it's exactly the same. And finally, the third piece to this is, and it's a combination of what we have done as far as putting up fires, which has affected forest composition and it has affected ecosystems. But with changing climate looking forward, the science is telling us that we're going to see a lot more fire. And not just, wow, this was a bad fire year, but 2 years ago it was really wet and we didn't have fire. We're talking about an order of magnitude increase in the amount of fire. And climate change and the impacts of climate change and the changes to our ecosystem in our part of the world will, for a large part, be brought here by fire. The changes will be brought by fire. So that is the background of where we are right now. So where are we right now? There's a lot of numbers on here. This is looking at high hazard forests in the regional district of central Kootenays. I would say whether you went a little bit east or a little bit west, we'd largely see the same numbers. The important stuff here, within the RDCK, there's 20,000 hectares of high priority, in other words, high hazard forests that are considered to be high hazard on Crown land, and almost an equal amount on private land. So there's 40,000 hectares of high risk forest within 2 kilometers of our communities. And if anything, this was based on 2008 numbers when the community wildfire protection plans were being done. We're updating those plans now. And if anything, these numbers will be increased because of course we've been putting out fires. We've been building more homes into the forest and that sort of stuff. I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining what this looks like and saying a little bit from a private perspective and from a Crown perspective, because obviously here in British Columbia, it's 95% Crown forest. We're surrounded by Crown forest. A lot of this Crown forest, according to this information, is at risk, but there's a lot of forests on private land that we really need to think about as well. The good news is it's very simple. If you're worried about your home or your community or your neighbors, there's really, really good resources out there. The FireSmart approach is very, very good. There isn't, although fire is complex, what you need to do to defend your home and defend your community, if you're starting from the asset and looking out, is relatively straightforward. The fire triangle is pretty basic science. And the engineering and the thinking behind what you need to do, that zone 1 within 10 meters of your home. And fortunately or unfortunately, we're now starting to get some pretty good data back on what happens if you protect your home compared to not protect your home. This report that was done about 18 months ago by Alan Westaver, who lives in Fernie, and is quite well known in wildfire mitigation circles. He went to Fort Mac after the fires there and took a look at what the results were, what homes were standing and what homes were not standing. 2,400 homes were destroyed. As we know, 90,000 people were evacuated. On average, the surviving homes rated with low to moderate hazard using the FireSmart criteria, which are very, very basic. You don't need to be trained. You don't need to download any special software. It's very, very simple to do this sort of thing. And on average, the homes that were destroyed rated high. So I think coming out of this fire year in British Columbia, we're going to be getting some new data. We don't have a lot of data on this sort of thing because we've never, quite frankly, taken very seriously what our risk is. That is now changing for a bunch of reasons. Which I think is a good thing, but it also raises a lot of expectations and raises a lot of need for doing things differently. And that's really what I'm going to talk about now. So we're transitioning from standing in your yard, looking out to the forest and thinking about what you need to do. And now we're going to start looking at more of a landscape level approach. This is looking down on Creston. This information is a little bit out of date. It actually should say 2008 rather than 2018. That's a typo. The red and the yellow are the areas that have high risk, high hazard forest adjacent to Creston. And that's based on proximity to assets, infrastructure, residences, and forest condition. Okay, and keep in mind, as pointed out, that the forest condition is really influenced by the fact that we've been putting out fires and we've been creating, literally manufacturing densely stocked, overstocked forests that are, for the large part, full of fuel. The next slide shows the areas that we've treated on municipal and on Crown land. And if it doesn't look like there's very much color in there, it's because there isn't. It's expensive, and I'm going to get into the details here. It's expensive, and it is, there's often a lot of overlap with other values, whether it's timber values, recreation values, water values, viewscapes, the same list that we talk about with all of these issues. But I think it's fair to say that if you compare what the risk is and what we've been able to achieve, remember, we've got 40,000 hectares of high risk forest. In the regional district, in 10 years, we've treated and reduced the risk on 400 hectares, which sounds embarrassingly low, but keep in mind that the regional district here in the Central Kootenays is leading the province, almost all other jurisdictions, in the amount of this sort of work that they have done, which I think frames both the amount of work we need to do and the amount of work that's in front of us. So I'm going to talk about what this looks like. What does it look like to be reducing the hazard within a forested landscape? The forest on the top is pre-treatment. And of course, for anybody who's walked around the Kootenays, we have an incredibly diverse forest, real range in ecosystem types, forest types. But the basic outcome of suppressing fires is we've got a lot of understory growth. We've got a lot of dead and dying trees. We've been creating great opportunity for pathogens, fungus, insects, et cetera, great drought conditions, overstocked. What we're trying to do is create a situation that is, in my mind, trying to replicate what a stand maintaining fire would do, which is reduce the density. There's really three important things. Clean up the surface fuel, which is very basic. Increase what we call the base to crown height. In other words, prune the trees so that there's separation between ground fire and crown fire, and you can fight a ground fire. And secondly, or thirdly, increase the distance between trees so that you have what's called a shaded fuel break, and you can make sure that if there is a crown fire, it slows down the intensity and the speed of that crown fire. That shaded fuel break, of course, you need to have fire resistant trees, which we have Douglas fir, yellow pine, western larch, and the deciduous trees are very good for that. That's what we're trying to replicate. So I'm gonna give some examples of what this looks like and where we have done this over the last few years here in the West Kootenays. But this work is happening all over the Columbia Basin, and some communities have really taken this on. Whistler, Williams Lake, outside of the basin, I mean, that I'm aware of, and Kelowna. Other communities haven't for a bunch of reasons, and we can talk about that. So this is in Blewett, a little bit west of Nelson. This is the Blewett Fire Hall. This is a before photo. Here's what it looks like afterwards. And for those of you who need to see some data to really feel like we're having a proper webinar, some of the important stuff here, the understory, if you look at layer 2, layer 3, layer 4, so basically everything less than 12.5 centimeters, 5,000 stems per hectare, right? That, and think about it, we've manufactured that. We create these conditions, and that's not uncommon. This is a great unit to do. It's very, very small. It's only a couple of hectares. There was a lot of dead and dying pine, some unhealthy grand fir. Retain the healthy fir and the larch and the deciduous. It's nice to do it right beside a fire hall because then it demonstrates what it looks like. Here's another area east of Creston. This is close to the Erickson water treatment plant. Very different forest. Here it is beforehand, after. Very different stand composition, species, a lot more cedar in this stand, a wetter site, a lot, really high recreation. It's adjacent to a gravel pit, which is not just here in the Kootenays, but perhaps worldwide, as we all know, fantastic places to do things like light cars on fire and fire off guns and generally have a serious pit party. So there's an ignition source there. It's right beside the water treatment plant. Which is an area that you want to protect. So a very different forest type, very different set of circumstances as far as the adjacent forest. Here's another area in Blewett outside Nelson. This used to be the Morning Mountain Ski Hill. It's now a very, very popular mountain bike area. This is what it looked like beforehand and after. In fact, it's just being completed. And that's the wrong slide. So we'll just click onto the Kingsgate stuff. Kingsgate, if you don't know where that is down near south of Yak on the border. This is actually the Canada-US border. This is the Canadian border people, all of their infrastructure. There's a water treatment plant in the middle of this, some residences here on Customs Road. Very different stand type, very heavy to pine, so before and after. You can see there's a lot more pine. What we discovered, or what we certainly acknowledge, is that the pine really doesn't make good wildlife trees. Dead and dying pine there isn't a lot to work with there, so you really have to work around the fir and the larch. And I'll show you one more example in Edgewood. If you've been to Edgewood, this is where the school is. The Legion is here. The downtown is down this way. Again, a very different forest type. Here's before and after. This is immediately adjacent to the school because of where it is and the historical use. A lot of firewood cutting, a lot of debris dumping, a huge amount of accumulation of debris, very high recreation values winter and summer, but also a really important amount of fir and larch and yellow pine, and it's an absolutely beautiful area right now. One of the reasons that we've chosen these areas were chosen with geographic and regional diversity. Here in the West Kootenays, and I think in a lot of different parts of British Columbia, you can't just fire up a chainsaw adjacent to a community or outside of somebody's yard and say, hey, trust us, we're here to help you. There's a long history of passionate engagement with forest management and communities, sometimes very supportive, sometimes anything but supportive. And over the last 10 years that we've been doing this work, one of the things that we've been trying to do is demonstrate what it looks like, provide before and after, work very, very slow and deliberately with neighbors, with fire fire departments, with elected officials, and earn that social license, and demonstrate that we're striving to reintroduce what a fire-maintained forest would look like. We're trying to essentially bring in some of the principles of resiliency back to the forest. It has proven to be effective here and elsewhere. We're not inventing this approach. They've been doing a lot of this sort of forest management south of us as you move into Oregon and Northern California and Colorado. And it is proven to be effective. You know, firefighters, wildland firefighters say that this sort of managed stand, a shaded fuel break, greatly reduces the intensity of the fire, the amount of you're reducing the amount of fuel. And the shaded part is really important because you're maintaining moisture levels, as opposed to a clear cut where the wind can actually increase, and because there's nothing to slow it down, and as a result you're drying out not only everything within that area but everything adjacent to that. But we've also determined that it's very, very expensive, and by expensive I mean at the very, very low end, $2,000 or $3,000 a hectare, and easily up to $8,000 or $10,000 a hectare. And some of the more expensive areas are $15,000 a hectare. If you can believe it, in Whistler, where they like to do things a little bit differently, they're looking at $25,000, $30,000 a hectare to work adjacent to the community. If we go back to the number of 20,000 hectares on Crown land within the regional district alone, at pick a number, $5,000 or $10,000 a hectare, we're just not going to be able to do it. There isn't enough money. There isn't enough political will, and quite frankly, there isn't enough capacity for people to do that much labor-intensive work. So we need to be doing things differently, but we need to do it in a way that we're still building in resilience and we're still maintaining the social license. And that's the sort of challenge that I like as a professional, and that's what I'm going to talk about now is looking into the future. The great thing is there's really good examples out there. This happens to be a photo of Harrop Proctor. That fire that was burning is actually just back over the back of this this slide. So that's Harrop Creek on the right. They've pretty well done only selective harvesting in the 10 or 15 years that they've been operating, and they do it and make money. They don't offset uneconomic logging with grant funding. They do a great job of building in resilience, protecting the water, protecting the community, leaving fire-resistant, healthy trees behind, and going anywhere from, this was an area that they were harvesting because of dead pine, but in some of these areas there might be a 10 or 15% crown closure, and in other areas in the front of the photo they might have 40-50% crown closure. It obviously depends on the condition, the species that are there. And Harrop isn't the only one. There's examples of partial cutting. I would say there's not enough examples. For obvious reasons, we foresters tend to like to cut down the big healthy trees first and load them on to make sure that we're getting those to the mill. And it's a different mindset to want to leave the big healthy trees and take out the sick and dying understory and the species that aren't as adapted as we look forward into a world with a changing climate. But I also think economically we need to look at these things differently. Fire looks at the map very differently than we do. So here's our very recent work. We've been updating the CWPPs, which is Community Wildfire Protection Plans, in Caslow in Area D. We've basically gone from Glade in Area I all the way up to the north end of Kootenay Lake, including Nelson. We're doing similar work in West Arm Park. And next year we'll be doing the rest of the regional district, including Edgewood and the Cusp, down around Creston in the East Shore, Salmo, around Castlegar. This is how we tend to look at these maps, you know, different polygons for different licensees, different colors for ownership. The village gets its own polygon. And of course, if we were to zoom in, we'd see a lot of other ownership or jurisdiction lines on here. There's Fortis. We're lucky in Castle, we have Fortis and BC Hydro for some reason. There's Ministry of Transportation. There's wildlife habitat management areas. There's a lot of other different old growth management areas, riparian areas. From a fire, of course, from the perspective of fire, they don't see any of that. They just see the three elements in the fire triangle, and that's really all they're interested in. And if we're going to manage the landscape differently and bring our costs down from 10,000 a hectare to numbers that we can afford and that we can expect political support for, and we can then hopefully adopt on the private land, we're going to really seriously need to do things differently. And so my last few slides here are looking at what does that look like? What does different look like given the complexity of ownership on the land, and given the complexity of the science behind not only forest management, but also around climate change. And let's be really clear of that complexity as well. It's always changing. Just when we think we've done almost enough research to understand it, we need to go out and apparently do more research so that we can better understand it. And even our concept of ownership is changing. The Tanaka, I think, and other First Nations have very clear rights and very clear ownership for part of this land. The governments are, as we speak, bringing their lawyers together to talk about who actually owns the land. So even though we've put our colors on them and handed out rights to timber companies and to other land managers, all of that is in a state of flux, just as it is ecologically. So there's a lot of moving parts. So there's really 3 slides for what I see as the solutions, and then we can invite you all in to discuss and ask questions, and I'd love to hear your ideas on this. We need to reduce the risk at the landscape level. These small little areas, it was great to do 2 hectares outside the Blewett Fire Hall. People drive by and go, wow, that's not so bad. I wonder how I can get that done here. And we're building that social license, and nothing can happen without it. In this part of the world, nothing can happen unless we maintain that social license. And we need to, but we need to look at the landscape level. And that's going to mean we're going to be traversing across different ownership structures, different tenures, and so on. That means we're going to need to collaborate with all of the land managers. And by land managers, I don't just mean people like RPFs. I mean Ministry of Transportation. I mean First Nations. I mean community watershed groups. I need recreation people, fire departments, and we split our firefighting into 2 very distinct units. We've got the structural people who have the fire halls in our communities, and we have the wildland BC wildfire services people doing their job. So both of those groups of people need to be at the table. And as easy as that sounds, that is very, very difficult. It's real work to convene people and have meaningful conversations around a new subject matter with real dollars on the table, and try and come up with shared decision making when it's so new to people. And I don't think we can underestimate that. Getting people together is a great idea. It's often hard work. It's often very frustrating. In some cases, people may perceive they're giving up power, and in other people may see this as an opportunity to get power. And all of that, I think, is is things we need to think about as we move forward. We also need to move beyond just thinking we're going to pay for this with grant money or tax money or CBT money or whatever the case may be. We need merchantable timber. The good news is, I mean, there's fluctuations. Timber prices are really good right now. And at least in the West Kootenays here, I'm not sure how it is in Skookumchuck, but our mill, our pulp mill in Castlegar, Selgar, is very, very keen to be innovative. They want to look at pre-commercial thinning. They want to access other people's slash piles. And if we can find a way to turn the material that we're currently paying people to pile and burn or to chip and to haul away, if we can monetize that, then we can do more work across a larger area. But again, we're talking about change, and with change often comes conflict. But we need to do that. And not to mention, there's issues around stumpage. How do you bring grant money into the managed forest without upsetting the softwood lumber agreement? What about stocking standards if you don't want to set it right back to a clear cut? There's a lot of technical issues in there. But again, we need to collaborate in order to do that. And of course, we need to do all of that and while maintaining the social license, which means we need to communicate, often communicate a lot better than we are. And we need to open ourselves up as the professionals or the land managers for criticism, or often just participation in conversations that are driven by fear or driven by frustration, because wildfire, partly because it's primeval and partly because it's so powerful, really digs down deep into the emotions of many people. The good news is, and there's some really, really good work going on. There's really important funding right now. Last fall, late summer, we transitioned from one government to a new government, literally right in the middle of a wildfire season. In fact, I seem to remember Premier Horgan's very first words as soon as he took office were about wildfires, because Williams Lake was being evacuated. They're now studying and reviewing the fire year, and they're going to come up with a bunch of recommendations. Everybody's kind of holding their breath. In the meantime, Columbia Basin Trust is really significantly investing in this and helping communities. The Union of BC Municipalities brings in about $10 million a year through the Strategic Wildfire Prevention Initiative, and makes that available to communities. And about 2 years ago, the Forest Enhancement Society was started. There's 5 objectives that they have, from climate to wildlife to uneconomic or inaccessible forests. But a big part of what they're funding right now is wildfire. And depending on which envelope you're looking at, they've got $150 or $200 million to spend. Those last 2 are likely going to change as a result of the government review. And when they change, CBT may change as well. But that money is available. And here in the Kootenays, we're accessing a lot of that money. Some regions, some communities aren't accessing that money. And of course, if you're outside the basin, you don't get to access the trust at all. How do we increase the public support? One of them is we need to support the private efforts to reduce risk. It's one thing to do a better job on Crown land. It's another thing to help people like us who own or rent homes, who might live in the interface, to reduce risks. Governments will never, I don't think, just give you money to do it. But what sort of tools can be made available, whether it is information about how to FireSmart your home, or looking out into your private forest land, prescription assistance, information about mills, information about how to get a timber mark, all of that sort of stuff. So I think a lot of work needs to be done around that, and that's something that local governments, fire chiefs, and others are really focused on right now. I think part of it too is we need to showcase innovation and the champions who are out there. I think we're often so busy doing this work that we don't make time to tell others about the work that we're doing. And it might be part of our Canadian modesty. But I've worked in this field for 10 years, and every day I'm hearing about new people within a few hours or just over the mountains or up in Revelstoke or whatever the case may be, who are doing really, really interesting stuff. And I think we need to find better ways to connect with each other so that we can learn from each other. There's a lot of really, really interesting stuff. I just learned yesterday in an unrelated conversation that on the Akam Reserve north of Cranbrook, they're working with BC Wildfire Services to reintroduce fire and to do some really innovative prescribed burning. And like, what better place to do that? Not only because of the forest type, but also because of the Tanaka long history with fire. I would love to learn more about that sort of stuff. And then finally, I think we need to come clean, quite frankly, on the link between what we're trying to do and climate change. The days of sort of, is it happening? Gee, why don't we hedge our bets? Why don't we do more research? I think every time we talk about this sort of stuff, every time fire chiefs get up and talk about why it's important for you to spend a few $100, a few $1,000, or a few hours of your time to reduce the risk around your house, they should be talking about climate change. Climate change affects water. It affects the forests. It affects our infrastructure, which is everything from cell phones to water to power. And we need to, as awful as it is to be expanding the complexity, we need to frame what we are trying to do within the reality, in particular, looking forward. And the good news is, here in the Kootenays, we've got a lot of expertise. The CBT is very, very supportive and championing this idea that we need to be holding ourselves accountable for climate change and coming up with tools for adaptation and mitigation. And increasingly, fire chiefs and mayors and water user groups are thinking about it and having conversations about where do we get the money to increase the holding capacity of our reservoir, as one example. And all of that is really, really necessary, and necessary, but also difficult. The costs are enormous of trying to reduce the risk and the hazard, in particular because we've done such a good job of creating such a problem for ourselves. But the good news is, increasingly more and more people are wanting to talk about this and wanting to get involved and wanting to explore that complexity as painful as it is. Which comes back to my last slide. It's not a picture of fire. It's a picture of people. In this case, one of the activity operators talking to neighbors who were concerned about what are you going to do to our walking trail and our mossy glen, and that community now is extremely supportive of the work, and they want the local licensee and local government to do a lot more. But it started with a conversation. Walking along that trail and getting to know each other and learning to trust each other. And I think as unscientific as that sounds for the Kootenay Conservation Program, who part of me thinks that, geez, it should be so scientific. I do strongly believe that it needs to be a little more up close and personal and using some of our old-fashioned communication skills. So thank you, everybody. I hope we have enough time for questions. Hopefully you have some questions. Adrian, I'm not able to see the question box, so if it's okay with you, I'll ask you to let me know what questions have come up.
Okay, John. I'll start with the first question. During the planning process, are managers including multiple goal achievement in the process? examples: soil nutrient enhancement, soil moisture restoration, ungulate forage, etc.
Absolutely. I think obviously the list is longer than that. I think we're lucky in the Kootenays because we've been given a lot of reasons to expand that list of values that we need to include. I know that some people in fire management would say, if I'm a professional and if I'm building a bridge, how come I don't have to take into account anything other than the engineering of that bridge? How come with wildfire I have to take in, I almost have to sort of temper my prescription to take into account all of these other values? So I think there is some complexity to that question, but the list of the values, including the ones that were provided, is very long. Of course, they change and expand and contract depending on the site, depending on who the neighbors are, depending on the values and the ownership and who's adjacent. But absolutely.
Great. Another question is, does treatment include prescribed burning? If so, is the consumable fuels being left in situ or pile and burn?
I think that's a great question. If we want to do this better, we need to reintroduce fire, and that is what prescribed burning is. Our ability to do that, partly because that tool has almost been removed from our toolbox for a long time. Prescribed burning used to be done a lot more, and now is hardly done at all. It's partly because of concerns with pollution from smoke, and I think those are justified. We need to reintroduce fire, partly from a cost perspective, partly from an ecological perspective. It's more appropriate, but currently, the majority of the work we're piling and burning, which is very, very expensive. Of that 10,000, I figure probably half is piling and burning. And then there's also chipping. Sometimes chipping is done on site and broadcast, and sometimes it's shot into the back of a truck and hauled off site, depending on a number of factors. That's even more expensive than burning. So I aspire to see us doing broadcast burning as appropriate a lot more in the coming years.
Thanks, John. Next question. Strata of 34 houses in the middle of a forest. Any slides on steps to take to protect the strata from wildfires?
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up with more detailed information. What is included in FireSmart works. Start at the asset and work out, and the basic principles as laid out in FireSmart work very, very well. But quite often, a strata of 34 homes, that's a big job, and of course, maybe all of your neighbors aren't interested, or maybe they don't live there, or whatever the case may be. Just because you live in a community of 34 people doesn't mean you share the same brain. So it becomes tricky in a community. Increasingly, what local governments are getting involved in is doing emergency and evacuation planning, which includes looking at where are the community scale vulnerabilities, whether that's water, is the power threatened by fire, that sort of stuff. And there's also programs such as the FireSmart Canada Community Recognition Program that helps communities build the capacity from a governance perspective. In other words, how do they organize, and then how do they identify the priorities at a community scale? And community is really a neighborhood. And there are some communities who have done that. A lot of our First Nations in the basin are getting involved in this. Here in the West Kootenays on Heddle Road and in Queens Bay, they've done this, and I believe in Caslow, the Back Road area, and maybe Woodbury are looking at this. It's a really good program that provides tools and support for that. And increasingly, like I say, local fire departments and local government, whether that's municipal or regional district, are are getting involved, and we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. The CBT is supporting local governments to build tools and build capacity and pay people so that it doesn't have to be volunteers doing more of it.
Great. The next question is, can you expand on the relationship between species composition related to silviculture and tree planting and forest fire risk? Is there any observable difference in our 4 to 6+ species planted in the Kootenays versus 1 to 3 in northern interior, Prince George area, in welcoming or deterring forest fire?
Well, you know, say what you want about forest management. One thing we do is we use locally adapted seeds to grow our seedlings. And that doesn't happen everywhere in the world. The reason we have 5 or 6 trees here in the Kootenays versus 2 or 3 species up north is because our ecosystems are very different, and the subboreal and boreal forests have fewer number of species, whereas down here, we've got 8, 10, 12 different species of trees. It may be appropriate from a forest management perspective to plant cedar, hemlock, lodgepole pine. From my perspective, when we're looking at community wildfire protection and in particular climate resilience, we need to be looking at trees, I believe, that are adapted for future conditions. Those are, and obviously depends on site, because fir and larch aren't going to grow anywhere. But from a fire perspective, the reason that they're adapted so well is they grow with really, really thick bark, and the really big vets you see will have fire damage on them from stand maintaining fires coming through. But I think if you were to talk to climate scientists, they would say, yeah, but we don't want to box ourselves in with just fire adapted species. I think we need other species, whether it's pine, cedar, hemlock, etc. Because as smart as we are, we're not that smart. We can't see the future. I will say that, and I'm a forester. I'm not against clear cutting necessarily, but clear cuts do not achieve what we want to see from a community wildfire and a shaded fuel break perspective. First of all, you're opening up the forest and allowing the wind to come in. And second of all, if you've ever walked through a stand of trees on a good growing site that is 15 or 20 years old, you might have 5,000 stems per hectare. They might be 20, 30 feet high, and that's a solid cube of fuel. And it looks great on a rainy day, but you get 50 or 60 dry days like we did last summer. It just becomes a solid cube of fuel. So at that point, it doesn't matter what species are growing in there. I hope that answered that question.
Excellent. The final question that we have right now, feel free, anybody who would like to ask more questions, just use your question and answer box at the lower part of your screen. This is the next question for you, John. Do you know how effective fire, i.e. ash, charcoal, and smoke, is at distributing nutrient broad scale?
Wow. I don't. I'd like to think there's better ways to distribute nutrients than ash and smoke. But I'm sure in the grand universal wisdom of fire, not only the burning embers, but in a big fire, the burning chunks, there is some value in that. And of course, lodgepole pine seeds only grow after a fire. And there's a lot of examples of plants that depend on fire, and of course animals and their habitats. I really don't know about the smoke and the ash and the nutrient transfer that way. Really interesting question though.
Okay, we just had another question come in. What role do healthy wetlands play in fire regime planning? Yeah,
great question. Well, obviously in the work we do, when we're looking at the landscape and looking at the more stand level when we're writing prescriptions, wetlands need to be protected with, appropriate buffers to make sure that their functioning hydrologically is maintained. What's interesting about riparian buffers along a linear feature like a creek, though, is if you treat that as a reserve, so it's a riparian reserve zone, it can actually act as a wick. If a fire starts, for instance, down on the lake, that reserved, untreated riparian reserve zone can act as a wick and allow fire to move up a steep ravine or whatever the case may be. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we do away with riparian protection, but ecologically, we also need to understand that maintaining an unhealthy forest immediately adjacent to a creek, because we've been suppressing fire, has its consequences. But all of that, I think, is part of the complex conversation that goes with some basic principles, which is we need to do everything we can to identify and protect wetlands and other riparian features without a doubt. That hydrological cycle is so important to resilience looking into the future, but also it might even be very, very important to help communities get back on their feet as far as having water, not to mention providing water to actually fight the fire.
Thanks, John. Next question. Recent presentation era of mega fires refers to patch management versus firebreak. Can you comment on patch management approach?
I'm not familiar with that presentation or that that phrase, patch management. To distinguish my understanding, a firebreak is what you might think of when you see a 60-meter high voltage right-of-way for a power line. All of the vegetation is cut down. The forest is 60 meters apart. That's a firebreak. A shaded fuel break is what I've been describing, where the function of the forest is maintained. You're trying to mimic a stand maintaining fire, retain the resilient species. I think there is a role for a firebreak, but I don't think it is. Well, first of all, we wouldn't have the social license to do it all over the place. And so I think we need to build on the fire breaks we have, which are roads and rights of ways, and maybe even some naturally occurring ones with rocks and wetlands and that sort of stuff. The patch approach, I think, is really good, if I understand what that means, because part of diversity is understanding and appreciating that the hazard isn't everywhere. And the hazard is going to be quite literally where the high hazard is. And you need to be focusing on those areas first. You don't just start in the west and move to the east and treat every hectare exactly the same. You need to focus on the high hazard areas. And that might be 12 hectares immediately adjacent to the fire hall. It might be 250 hectares immediately south of town. And so patches, of course, can change in size. But we need to maintain habitat, connectivity, hydrological function, which is the untreated part often of that patch approach, if I understand what is meant by that.
That's great. There is just a comment here on chat I'll just bring up in case someone wants to ask a question about it. If ecosystem enhancement was practiced on the urban wildland interface, it would reduce ungulate populations, and a cost savings would be to use the manual labor to provide training to youth and also achieve rehabilitation of criminals to adapt reintroduction to society.
But there's a lot of really important ideas in there. And I'm not sure I caught all of it. I'm not sure that it's necessarily an either or between doing ecosystem restoration and either eliminating or enhancing ungulate winter range. I'm not a wildlife person, and I do know it's very, very complex, but I think one of the outcomes, for example, of reintroducing prescribed fire would, I imagine, would potentially, if it's done properly, be significant increases in ungulate winter range, which as I understand, is one of the reasons that First Nations have used fire for so long is to increase habitat values. But that is the other parts of that around providing opportunities for people to work. I think that's a really important point. Spending money, if it's your money, you might say that's a really bad thing. Spending money means jobs. Spending money means training, and those jobs and training can go beyond simply hiring an experienced crew. I think there's a lot of opportunity for reconnecting with the land, for training people who are disadvantaged economically in one way or another, and whether that's because of a criminal past or substances or whatever the case may be. There's such a breadth of work that needs to be done, and it's right outside our communities. I love that sort of thinking.
Well, that's great, John. Thank you so much for your presentation. We really enjoyed it. We've had lots of participation, and I'd like to thank all the participants for joining us today in the webinar. Please expect a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to an online post-webinar survey with just 7 questions. We'd love to have your feedback, as we'd like to help plan for future webinars. Our next webinar will be Fish and Wildlife Mapping, Tools Everyone Should Know About with Albert Chirico, and it's taking place Wednesday, February 28th, 10 to 11 Pacific Standard Time, or 11 to noon Mountain Standard Time. A registration link will be included in your follow-up email. We'll see you then. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Adrienne. Thanks a lot, folks. And please get in touch with me if you have any other questions. Hope to see you out there one day.